I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all and thank you for having joined this webinar, which forms part of the MFSA's effort to engage with the industry in relation to the bank's risk management framework, which is instrumental to reach one of the main goals of bank stress tests, this being to measure the bank's resilience based on macroeconomic and hypothetical scenarios that are severe but plausible and forward-looking. At the same time, stress tests can identify risks and vulnerabilities associated with the bank's business model and thus inform business decisions too. This webinar is aimed at providing insights into the expectations of the MFSA in this regard. These range from scenarios used and their implementation to how stress test outputs should interact with the risk management framework and recovery plan. Before giving you a quick preview of today's program, I wish to highlight a couple of points. First of all, the MFSA takes security very seriously, and this webinar is being conducted using Microsoft Teams, which follows all the security best practices. For this live transmission, we are also taking all the necessary precautions and protocols established by the health authorities in view of COVID-19. Secondly, please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on the MFSA's website. Thirdly, certificates of attendance can only be generated if you logged in to this webinar using your email address and full name. As you can appreciate, no certificates can be issued to individuals logging in anonymously. Also note that all participants who have logged in with their credentials and have not received a certificate of attendance may request the certificate within 3 months from the date of this webinar. Certificates requested after such period will not be issued. If you are currently not logged in with your credentials because you have not created a Microsoft account yet and wish to receive a certificate of attendance, you may access our guidelines available on the event page of our website that have been prepared to help you create a Microsoft account in order for you to be able to log in using your personal details. Kindly submit your questions in the Q&A section of this webinar, which can be found on the right-hand top corner of the screen. Questions must be submitted prior to the Q&A session dedicated of this webinar. Now, on to this morning's program. We will start with the introductory remarks delivered by David Eacott, Head Banking Supervision, MFSA, which will be followed by a series of presentations delivered by Ilias Georgakopoulos, Analyst Banking Supervision, MFSA, on the different aspects of the stress testing framework. We will be having 2 coffee breaks at approximately 10:15 and 11 of 10 minutes each, and we will end our webinar with a Q&A session at approximately 11:25. Now I pass on the microphone to David Eacott, Head Banking Supervision. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. My name is David Eacott, and I'm the Head of Banking Supervision at the MFSA. Stress testing is a very important part of the regulatory framework, which regulators introduced after the last financial crisis. We all learned then that we could not be complacent about the sustainability and viability of business models of banks if we did not objectively and rigorously examine the threats to them. In an uncertain world, that is ever more important, and our world is being impacted by climate change, changes in trade flows, which are making this a very important exercise for all banks here in Malta. Regulators use the stress test in the ICAP for 3 things. The first is to determine the quality of board understanding of its own business model and how it is informing itself on the risks to viability. That contributes towards our governance assessment. We also use it to examine the risks themselves and their likely impact on the business model, and that informs our business model assessment. And in conjunction with other documents and other information that we receive from banks, we are able also to evaluate the quality of risk management and internal controls. This presentation is therefore a very important staging post, and I'd like to hand over to my colleague Ilyas, who will take you through our work and the way we approach this here at the regulator. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Welcome to our session. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide insights into our expectations on stress-related topics. Before starting, let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Ilias Georgiakopoulos. I'm part of the Banking Supervision Unit and specifically of the team that supervises less significant institution. Now, let's start with the presentation and the first section, which contains some parts of the EU regulation that highlight the purpose of stress testing and provide guidance on what an appropriate stress testing framework or program should look like. There are two articles that I would like to draw your attention to. Starting from Article 177 of the CRR, we have that an institution shall have in place sound stress testing processes for use in order to assess its capital adequacy, which is one of the objectives of stress tests. Article 97 of the CRR is more about guidance to the national competent authorities and provide some aspects on what we should examine or evaluate when we look at stress testing. I would also like to highlight that point A and B provide a good indication why an appropriate stress testing framework should be in place, which I will discuss later in the presentation. And more recently, because the risk environment is evolving, regulation and by extension stress testing has to evolve. We have the introduction of environmental, social, and governance risk with the CRD5. Another part of the regulation, but it's more from the recovery and resolution side, is Article 33 of the BRRD, and highlights that there should be an appropriate stress testing framework because any support measures that are related to capital shortfall established in any stress test, which could be the SSM-wide or our stress test or any equivalent exercises. And this is important when it comes to precautionary recapitalization. In the last part of this slide, you can see more references. Specifically to the EBA and ECB guidelines, which we tend to use in our work and STREPS. And in essence, they provide a more detailed guidance to the credit institutions on stress testing. And in a nutshell, they cover elements such as stress testing, government structure and how they should be used. They also cover the different methodologies about stress testing and how they should be applied. They also cover data infrastructure and they provide a list of non-exhaustive risk categories that should be considered. Now, supervisory expectations for an ICAP stress test. The focus of this part is about our expectation, what we expect to see actually in an ICAP stress test. And this could be how you present the results and how stress testing should be used in risk management. But before delving into it, let's see why stress testing is important. It's important because it allows a credit institution to evaluate its resilience to relevant shocks and therefore its viability. It can also help an institution to identify vulnerabilities or any residual areas of uncertainties or risks. One example could be second round effects, which can further deteriorate the loss absorbing capacity and solvency position of the bank. And ultimately, stress tests can be used to inform strategic planning. Now, one way to support what I have just mentioned is to take a forward-looking view in stress testing. And this means that scenarios should be 3 years long, because in prolonged period of stress, you can capture risks in a more meaningful fashion, and therefore you can plan proactively. To give you an example, let's assume that there is a bank which is heavily exposed to construction, and following a very severe economic downturn. In the third year of the stress test, we see that the NPL ratio is much higher, the income is much lower, and profits take a big hit. Now, this could be an indication that the banks should start thinking about mitigating actions, or perhaps whether diversification is maybe helpful. And this can be better captured when the stress testing framework has a forward-looking view. Overall, as a general comment here, I would say when we see these elements, some elements relating to the 3 bullet points that I have just mentioned in ICAPs, or we get evidence through our meetings with bank officials, it contributes to demonstrate to us that the board has considered stress testing effectively and also as a risk management tool. And it's also a demonstration of the quality of the board in this area. Now, before start thinking about the stress testing framework per se or its technicalities, there are 2 important aspects to be considered: governance and data infrastructure. The reason is that through appropriate governance arrangements, the stress testing framework can be challenged. For example, the modeling assumptions, whether the scenario is appropriate for the business model of the bank, and therefore further improvements can be made. And this relates to my point in the slide that the management body should approve and understand the stress testing program, and also oversee its implementation and performance. On the data side, it is crucial that appropriate data infrastructure is in place, because you can have a very good stress testing framework, but if the underlying data is not reliable, the result of the stress test most likely will not be very reliable. And this is important, especially when we are considering an example of or a scenario that is trying to capture risk at the very end of the risk distribution. Another element that I would like to highlight here is that the data infrastructure should support data aggregation capabilities and also capture off-balance sheet risk, because they can pose a threat to a credit institution. Turning to the next slide, another topic that I would like to discuss is the principle of proportionality. Overall, we expect high priority institutions. This terminology might change to high risk, high impact going forward, but overall high priority institutions should have a higher level of sophistication in its stress testing framework or program. And this is because they play an important role in the banking system. So we expect to have a better framework in order to better capture the risks that they are exposed to. The same expectation applies for credit institutions, which have, for example, a total assets with less than 1 billion. And I should also say that for high priority institution, other criteria that we can use is that high priority is also equal to a credit institution with total assets equal or above 1 billion. On the other side, a small and non-complex or less complex institution may implement less sophisticated stress testing programs. And they could have more stylized or imported scenario. They could have less granular Modeling. As a general comment here, I would say that the better the stress testing framework is, the more accurate the risk profile of the bank will be, which we will also consider in our work and SREPs. Now, this part is about the different steps involved in order to do a stress test. I will talk about the first three items that you are seeing in the slide, since they are closely related. The first thing one has to consider when designing a scenario is to identify a set of risk factors that are relevant to the business model of the bank. In this table, you see an example. It's an illustrative example of a number of risk factors that are relevant to a bank that has exposure to the property market and market risk. We would expect credit institutions to present the assumption used in the stress test clearly to the MFSA and to the board. And this is important because it can help the process of challenging the stress testing framework I was mentioning earlier. Now, one way that you could do this is to have a table of this format that you are seeing in the slide, and this can be included in the ICAP or in an annex in the ICAP. We would also expect to see at least one severe economic downturn scenario, apart from an idiosyncratic and a combined scenario. And the logic here is you have one scenario which is institution specific, then you have another scenario which is market-wide in order to test how the bank reacts to a market-wide scenario. And then you have a combined scenario, which in essence combines the institution specific and perhaps the economic downturn in order to further assess its resilience when these two scenarios happen. Lastly, we expect, as I was mentioning earlier about the forward-looking view, we expect the scenarios to be 3-year long, and it is important that the scenarios are appropriately applied to the balance sheet. With this, I will move on to the next slide. Once there is an appropriate scenario in place, it has to be linked with different risk areas and changes in risk parameters that are going to be affected by it. To give you an example, suppose that there is an economic downturn, which is paired with increase in unemployment, lower business volumes, price corrections in the property market, and difficulties in the household debt servicing capacity. Now, this type of scenario will affect credit risk because we expect lower income, lower level of collateral, which will have an impact on the PDs and LGDs. Another element of this simplistic example could be a lower level of interest rates, which we expect to affect liabilities and assets differently. And we could also expect repricing in equity. Ultimately, the impacts that I have just described need to be mapped onto the balance sheet. For example, this could be profit, retained earnings, risk-weighted assets, which in essence they will contribute to calculating key regulatory ratios. Overall, the main point here is that scenario have to be appropriately applied to the balance sheet, and the reason, and this is why I have this presentation, this graph here, because sometimes we see credit institutions that have a market, that have a scenario that affect market risk, but the investment or dividend income is not affected by it, or they haven't accounted for credit counterparty risk. Therefore, if some elements of the scenario and their impacts are left unstressed or unchanged, ultimately the risk-weighted assets and some components of the P&L will not accurately reflect the true impacts of the scenario. Now, in terms of measuring the impact of stress tests, we would expect to see how stress tests affect the capital position of the bank, namely CET1 in addition to Tier 1 and total capital on an aggregate level. And we will also expect to see their impact on the leverage ratio, because this would provide a measure of the exposure of the bank to the risk of excessive leverage. Now, on the performance side, here in the slide, you can see a non-exhaustive list of performance ratio that credit institutions, or at least high priority, may need to think about when they assess the results of stress tests in relation to their business model. Of course, there are some other elements that you can include in your assessment, for example, loan to deposit ratio or concentration indicators, but this mainly depends on the business model of each bank. Now, the next topic I would like to discuss is the results and management actions, as well as recovery capacity. Starting off with the results, here you see a graph we expect to see in ICAP. For illustrative purposes, the stress is a very benign one, and in a way linear, but this could change if, for example, you account for non-linearities in the stress test. For example, if there is a relatively strong non-linear relationship between a credit risk and foreign exchange market risk. However, the main point here is that we need to see how the capital base is affected before and after the stress, and this has to be done in relation with the capital composition and risk appetite trigger. You can also include some early warning indicators that you have in your risk appetite, and this is coming from our reviews of ICAPs. Because some credit institutions do not present things in a clear way, and as always, it's important that the board has a clear understanding of how the stress test is impacting the capital position of the bank. Here is another. You see another graph, the one on the right-hand side, which is basically taken from the EU experience. But you may also choose to have, or at least high priority credit institutions should or may need to think about when they present the driver of the stress test. The nice thing about this graph is that you can easily identify the drivers and their impact on capital ratios. And as I mentioned before, the board has to have a very good understanding of the drivers of the stress test. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now let's assume that we've done the stress test and we end up in a situation where the capital depletion results close or below to the absolute minimum, the red line that you see in the graph. In this case, credible management and recovery actions should exist in order to restore compliance with capital requirements. And it is important that these actions, especially the recovery options, are assessed in terms of plausibility in stress conditions and how effective they are, because in essence, this would provide the recovery capacity. Another dimension of this example is that stress testing and recovery capacity analysis should be used in order to calibrate risk appetite thresholds, because they provide another way of aligning your risk appetite with the actual risk revealed by the stress tests. Moving on to the next topic, reverse stress testing. Reverse stress testing, what is it? In essence, reverse stress test is a stress test, but starts from the opposite end. So you have to identify a predefined outcome. In general terms, reverse stress testing needs to answer three questions. What would it take the entity to fail? what event or a combination of events might lead to this outcome. And the third question is what we can do now in order to avoid this happening. Therefore, reverse stress testing is another way to link ICAP and recovery planning, because it can support aspects of ICAP and recovery planning. For example, they can identify the macro and financial conditions that could lead the business model to become non-viable, and therefore the conditions under which the recovery could be planned. And also reverse stress testing can be used in order to assess the conservatism of the ICAP assumptions, for example, the severity of the scenarios. And one way to do it would be to compare the results of the stress test and the assumption with those featured in reverse stress testing. The last slide of this section has some of the main shortcomings that we've seen when we review ICAPs or through our meetings with bank officials. But if I were to briefly summarize them, I would say the main ones are the lack of consideration of all material risks and risk factors, inadequate consideration of risk concentration, inadequate implementation of scenarios onto the balance sheet, and this in a way relates to my comment earlier that stress tests should be appropriately applied to the balance sheet. And from my governance perspective, I would say inadequate challenge of the stress testing framework. So this is the end of the first part of my presentation. We will now take a break, a 5-minute break, and we will continue with the next topic, which is demonstrating the use test and management buffers in stress testing. Thank you. Welcome back to the webinar. So the next topic of my presentation is titled Demonstrating the Use Test. In essence, I have mentioned what we are seeing in the slide in the previous sections. For example, that the stress testing framework should be used in order to calibrate risk appetite limits, or they should act as a planning tool in order to assess new or existing business strategies and their use and their impact on the use of capital. But the reason for having this section here, apart from completeness purposes, is to highlight the importance of demonstrating the use test. I will give you one example from our reviews of recovery plans, but the same logic applies when we are discussing management actions. We've seen some credit institutions that they identify a number of recovery actions, but they do not really demonstrate if they have taken a holistic approach. For example, let's assume that one recovery option is to initiate a capital increase from issued and paid up capital. So, some of the things that we need to see and you need to demonstrate include, for example, previous experience in this option. If there are any legal or regulatory and operational aspect that may slow down the implementation of this recovery option. Another important thing to demonstrate is the timing of the recovery action invocation, because it's important for the board to actually know the timing and how long it will take to actually implement this recovery option. The reason is that if these things have not been considered or demonstrated, it could undermine the effectiveness of the recovery options, especially if we are having a situation where the capital position is deteriorating and the implementation of the recovery action is taking longer than originally planned or anticipated. So the next slide is about the management buffers. This is another thing that credit institutions have to demonstrate. But let me highlight what is a management buffer and its role. Overall, it's an amount of capital above regulatory and supervisory minima and internal capital thresholds that has to be determined in order to allow a credit institution to sustainably follow its business model without endangering capital adequacy. Therefore, in non-stress considerations, the management buffer should be set in a way that allow a credit institution to comply with the overall capital requirements plus Pillar 2 guidance. Now, in stress conditions, for example, in prolonged periods of sufficiently adverse developments, that cause a serious depletion in CET1, for example, it might be acceptable for a credit institution not to meet its Pillar 2 guidance and combined buffer. However, in this case, a credit institution is expected to determine an adequate level of management buffers in order to comply with the absolute minimum, in order to be above the total SREP capital requirements. And as you can see, the absolute minimum is the red line in the graph. And this would also help you to continue pursuing your intended business model. Therefore, what I have described, that's the main idea that you have to keep in mind when considering what appropriate management buffers we should have in place. Of course, there are other elements that have to be considered. For example, whether you are envisaging a business model expansion or how the business model is performing. Because if you have a business model expansion, or you're expanding your business, you might want to keep a higher management buffer in order to safeguard your capital requirements. Another thing that has to be considered is the market conditions, because generally speaking, the weaker the capital base is, the more expensive and harder it will become for a credit institution to follow its business model. Of course, this has to be considered in relation to the risk appetite, and another element that has to be considered here is the maximum distributable amount, because it's placed below the P2G. So in a scenario where your stress indicates that you will breach the combined buffer, this might mean that there might be some constraints or restrictions on earnings distribution. So for institutions that, let's say, place this at the top of the agenda, management buffers is a good way of safeguarding earnings distribution. So this is the end of my presentation. And before I pass the floor to Romina, let me provide you with a quick recap. So today I talked about the need that credit institutions should have in place an appropriate stress testing framework according to their business model, size, and complexity, which has to be supported by good governance and data infrastructure, as well as form part of risk management and strategic planning. I also highlighted some elements of the use test or stress testing that you have to demonstrate. Lastly, I should also mention that if you want to present your ICAP to us, or if you want to discuss it during our minimum engagement level meetings, we can do so. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Ilias, once again. And we will now be taking a short break, just 10 minutes, and we'll see you back soon. May I remind you to submit your questions in the Q&A section that is found on the right-hand top corner of your screen. And we'll be answering all the questions there. Thank you very much. Hi. Thank you for joining once again this webinar. Okay, so as discussed, we have the list of questions we have received and which we will be tackling. Okay, Elias?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so can you expand on how management and senior management can demonstrate to the authority its effective use of stress test?
Thank you. So, in essence, my part of the presentation about demonstrating the use test covers this aspect, but of course there are other scenarios or occasions that you could demonstrate this. One way would be to do your internal assessment about whether the stress testing framework is appropriate for the business model and complexity of the bank. Another example could be, let's say that you are planning to expand your business model, or you are planning to introduce a new business line. Let's say, for example, you're planning to invest in structured notes, and the money will be used by a third party in order to give out loans. So now this would be one exposure. One way to assess how the introduction of this new business line will affect the balance sheet is to do a stress test. Now, this business line might not be material at the beginning, but it could be after 2 years. So it could be the case that you have other immaterial business lines at the moment, but after 2 or 3 years, they will become material. So one way to demonstrate to us that you have accounted for new business lines as a planning tool, or to the board, whether this development will affect the balance sheet, is to use the stress test. And this can be demonstrated in the ICAP or in the minutes or through our meetings with the banks.
Okay. What is the level of consistency between the management actions in the ICAP and the recovery plan?
So the answer to this question is that they have to be consistent. For example, when there is a set of management actions that are common between ICAP and ILAP, this could create an overlap, which could suggest that there might be some double counting. So, for example, if the banks have assumed some management actions and they are material and they have used them in the ICAP, then this has to be reflected in the feasibility and in the reassessment of the feasibility and effectiveness of the recovery options in the recovery plan, because this would provide an updated assessment of the overall capacity, recovery capacity of the institution.
Okay. In case we receive a higher P2G as a result of the regulatory supervisory assessment, would it be acceptable to adjust the management buffer downwards if it is sustained from the internal ST and the risk profile of the bank?
So there are two separate things here. There are two things that we have to consider. The Pillar 2 guidance, which the regulatory Pillar 2 guidance, which we said, the purpose of it is to have a buffer in order for the credit institutions to be able to withstand the stress test in a better fashion. Now, the management buffer is more about the buffer that banks would have in order to comfortably follow the business model. Now, if the view of a credit institution is that they should reduce the management buffer, this has to be demonstrated and supported by an appropriate stress testing framework and analysis.
Okay. What is the level of granularity of results you expect to see in the stress test?
Now here, we have two aspects. The first one is that through our reviews of ICAPs of small, let's say a non-complex or less complex institution, we've seen that they have provided a very good level of granularity. So overall, I would say that credit institution can increase the level of granularity that they want to present. For example, they might want to choose the non-performing exposure or the NPL ratio by different business line. For example, NPL on corporate loans or on retail, they could include the write-offs, depending on what's relevant for the business model. The second aspect is that the more granularity, if a credit institution has a better way of displaying the granularity in the ICAP, or they include more granular results, this is automatically a demonstration to us that they have considered all aspects of the stress test and how a scenario affects the balance sheet. And this it's a demonstration of the board and the management body that they have considered a good stress test, and it's a good risk management tool as well.
Okay. How will a good stress testing program be factored into the SREP?
As I mentioned during my presentation, the better the stress testing framework, the more accurate will be the assessment of the risk profile of a bank. What I mean is that if we see stress testing frameworks that are in line with our expectations, or they are in line with applicable guidelines, so they want to go up a step further, we will consider it positively in our steps when we do our assessment and our recommendation. Because in a way, institutions, they demonstrate that they have a good risk management practice in place, and they provide a better way to capture the risk that they are exposed to, or they might be exposed to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Why do small banks need to do sophisticated stress testing? Their balance sheets are quite simple, so why?
That's an interesting question. As I mentioned during my presentation, the scenario has to be appropriately applied to the balance sheet, and institutions should also cover all risk, all material risks. Now, if the balance sheet of a credit institution is simple, they might not need to have a very sophisticated stress testing framework. But here, what is important is that they have to demonstrate to the board why is that, and it has to be substantiated. And as a general comment, as I mentioned during my presentation, the better the framework, the more accurate the risk profile of the bank would be in terms of how the banks are capturing the risk. And this is important because the board should understand the interactions following a shock to the balance sheet.
How can one assess that the economic downturn scenario is severe enough?
Actually, there are a number of ways that the banks can do it individually. They can choose to do it individually or collectively. One way to go about it is to, for example, if we are talking about the macroeconomic assumptions, one way to go about it is to compare them with the EBA or ECB macroeconomic assumptions when they do their stress tests. Another way would be to look at historic data, and now we have the COVID-19 induced economic developments. And to me, this is a very good example of an extreme but plausible scenario. Another way would be to compare the impact of the scenario on the capital ratio and see the distance from the internal thresholds in the risk appetite. That would be a good indication. And the other way to do it is to do reverse stress tests, because as I mentioned during my presentation, you are trying to evaluate the situation that is going to lead a bank to fail. So this is already a very significant scenario. So that would be another good way to benchmark.
Thank you.
Sorry, one thing that I would like to highlight here is we've seen some credit institutions that have a very severe economic scenario, but the way they apply it on the balance sheet is not very appropriate. So, for example, they say that the GDP will decrease, but the interest income stays the same. So this, in a way, weakens the severity of the severe scenario they have considered. So it's important that, apart from a severe economic scenario, to have an appropriate applied shock.
Okay. Is the MFSA expecting reverse stress testing to feature in the ICAPs of all credit institutions or only for the high priority LSI?
That's a very good question. One thing that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about reverse stress testing is the purpose, and all credit institutions can benefit if they have a reverse stress testing framework, because it provides another way to challenge the severity of the scenario that we were discussing before, and also because of its nature, you can identify vulnerabilities that perhaps they are not uncovered during a normal stress test. And the interesting thing here is to, especially for the banks, is to apply it appropriately, so they have a scenario that will actually lead to a failure of the bank in order to serve the purpose of the stress test, but also benchmark it against the stress test that they have in the ICAP. Of course, now this has to be in line with the principle of proportionality. Some high priority institutions may want to go a bit further in terms of what granular data they present. Some smaller, less complex institutions, they might want to choose, for example, the assumptions, the results, or they just want to display the main drivers of the reverse stress test.
Okay. Okay. Can you cover static versus dynamic scenarios, and if LSIs are expected to have the 4 scenarios, including a static one?
That's another interesting question. The way to answer whether a static or dynamic balance sheet is appropriate is to look at the business model and then the composition of the different business lines. For example, if institutions are expecting that the balance sheet will remain stable over the medium term, over the next 3 years, let's say, then the static balance sheet might be appropriate. If we are talking about a credit institution that is trying to restructure a lot of its exposure, they are trying to introduce these new business lines in the next 2 or 3 years. This will create a change in the business mix. So in order to capture this, a dynamic balanced approach might be more appropriate. In any case, these things have to be justified, and also they have to be presented to the board, because this will also help challenge the stress testing frame, whether it should be a static one or a dynamic one. Now, in terms of how many scenarios they should be included, so there is not actually a limit. We expect to see at least 3 scenarios, but if credit institutions think that more, like 1 more or 2 more are appropriate, they can demonstrate to us why, and they are free to do so.
Fantastic, thank you. Also, given the lack of guidance from the EBA with regards to the reverse stress testing, what level of detail is expected for reverse stress testing?
So the EBA guidelines, they have a section about reverse stress tests. Maybe they do not provide a lot of guidance, but reverse stress testing, as I mentioned earlier, should be in line with the principle of proportionality. But the level of detail now, again, we have to think about the purpose of the reverse stress test. So we will definitely need to see the assumptions that will lead to an institution to fail. We will definitely need to see that the assumptions they have, they actually lead to the institution failing. And because the purpose of the reverse stress test is to identify this type of scenario and also the drivers, we would expect to see what is driving this reverse stress test, because that would be one an important aspect of reverse stress testing.
Very
and
good.
all this, of course, as I was mentioning before, they have to be demonstrated, and the board should be able to understand them.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. That's been very, very helpful. We have come to the end of the questions. The other questions we received were very similar in nature, so you have covered the subjects. I now pass on to David Ecott, Head Banking Supervision, MFSA, for the final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Wherever a bank is on its stress testing journey, and we've provided feedback individually to banks from our reviews undertaken last year, banks should always be continuing to evolve and improve their stress testing frameworks. They should adapt them to new business lines or new and emerging risks. Ultimately, as Ilias has set out, it is for the board to set and understand its own stress testing framework. The supervisors in my team engage with banks each year and discuss the improvements that banks are making to their ICAPs. That's an opportunity through dialogue to discuss how risks and issues are impacting the stress testing framework and the bank's balance sheet and its viability and sustainability. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we integrate our findings from those conversations and the reviews of the documents that are provided to us into our regulatory assessments, both the scores and indeed capital requirements. And if I leave you with Ilias's point that he made, the better quality the stress testing framework, obviously the better quality the dialogue that we can have, and therefore an understanding of the resilience of the bank as it's understood by its board. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I would once again like to thank Ilias for his presentation today and for having and all of you for having participated in this webinar through asking questions. My final thanks go to also the team of those who work behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. I would like to wish you all a pleasant day and please stay safe. Thank you very much.